Okay. Thank you very much for coming. I declare open the public hearing of the House of Representatives Standing Committee on the Social Policy and Legal Affairs in Canberra for the inquiry into local adoption. This is the first public hearing for the inquiry, and today we look forward to hearing from the Federal Department of Social Services and the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare. I would like to take this opportunity to provide some context for this inquiry for the information of interested parties. The committee acknowledges the profound effects of past forced adoption and removal policies and practices, which was formally acknowledged by the House of Representatives in its resolution of 3rd of December 2013. The focus of this present inquiry is not those past practices and policies. The terms of reference require the committee to consider how we might provide stability and permanency for children in out-of-home care and consider a nationally consistent framework to use when adoption is a viable option. Our inquiry is therefore intended to be forward-looking and solution-focused. In accordance with the committee's resolution of 20th of September 2016, this hearing will be broadcast on the Parliament's website and the proof and official transcripts of proceedings will be published on the Parliament's website. Those present here today are advised that filming and recording are permitted during the hearing. I remind members of the media who may be present or listening online of the need to fairly and accurately report the proceedings of the committee. I now welcome representatives from the Department of Social Services and the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare to give evidence today. For the Hansard record, would you each please state your full names and the capacity in which you appear before the committee?
Catherine Mandler, Branch Manager, Children's Policy, Department of Social Services.
Barbara Bennett, Deputy Secretary, Families and Communities, Department of Social Services.
Louise York, Head of the Community Services Group at the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare.
Christy Rathel, Senior Project Manager of the Child Welfare Unit at the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare.
David Braddock, the Head of Child Welfare Unit at the Institute as well.
Okay, thank you. Although the committee does not require you to give evidence under oath, I should advise you that this hearing is a legal proceeding of the Parliament and therefore has the same standing as a proceeding of the House. The giving of false or misleading evidence is a serious matter and may be regarded as a contempt of Parliament. The evidence given today will be recorded by Hansard and attracts parliamentary privilege. I now invite you to make a brief opening statement before we proceed to discussion, and perhaps we start first with the Department of Social Services to make a brief opening statement.
Thank you. The Department of Social Services made a written submission to the committee, and while I don't intend to repeat that because you have that, I'd like to just point out a few things. Some highlights is that state and territory governments have responsibility for statutory child protection and adoption of Australian children, and each state and jurisdiction we are well aware of has their own legislative framework, their own practices, their own reporting regime. So there are vast differences and yet some common similarity in those. For the last, I would say the last 2 or 3 years, there has been an increased focus across those jurisdictions and by community service ministers, in which the Commonwealth participates as a ministerial member, and across departments where we have a secretaries group that works on this. And it's been partly driven by that increasing amount of children that are out of home care. As at 30th of June 2017, there were 48,000 children in out of home care in Australia. And of these, 68% or 32,600 had been in out-of-home care for 2 or more years. This is obviously concerning. It's concerning about the stability, about family connection, about those good and core things that children need in family life. We've been working across with other departments, other state jurisdictions, and in particular the Victorian Department of Health and Human Services, and we're jointly working on developing a national approach to improve options for stable, safe and permanent care of children that are at risk of becoming in contact with the child protection system. And in this includes the option of adoption. I would have to say that there is not universal agreement on the concept of adoption, but there is pretty strong agreement about permanency and about guardianship, about not having children go in and out of the system and trying to make decisions that give them that permanent home. I have to also say that almost all jurisdictions refer to adoption, particularly if the child's already in out-of-home care in the child protection system, as an open adoption, which goes to your reference earlier about learning what's happened previously. In which my colleagues here can go more into the stats. In 16-17, 246 adoptions of Australian children were finalised, and that this is not a large number, but it is significant increase on previous years, and it's reflected by some change practices in the main by the New South Wales government. And so of those 204, the families were known to the children. Now, they were relatives or they could have been carers that they were placed within the care system. 143 of these adoptions, or 70%, were by foster parents, and 57 were by step parents. 42 were adoptions of children not already known, so other people that were in the system and the child was placed through adoption to them. The contribution that we do as the Commonwealth Department, that, as I said, has absolutely no legislative levers. It's about our ability to work at issues at a national level. And there are other examples where we do this. There is the Child Protection Framework. There is the Fourth Action Plan for protecting for women's safety. There's other examples where we're not the regulators, we're not the main investors, we're not the people on the ground doing the delivery, but we sit at the table with our state and territory jurisdictions about pushing national approach. A national approach can be about practice, it can be about regulation and legislation, it can be about collecting data. And that's a really important component of it, because of the way information can be gathered, recorded, viewed, different definitions. There's a number of areas in social policy space that we've increasingly worked with state and territory jurisdictions to try and have like collection of data. The priority for under the National Framework for Protecting Australian Children, which runs from 2019 to 2020, and we're in the process, 2009 to 2020, that 11 years, we're at the stage at the moment of developing and finalising the Fourth Action Plan, which will run for about the last 2 years of that national framework. A key priority for all governments through the life of the national framework is supporting children to safely remain in their families. So a lot of programs have been focused on early intervention and prevention measures. However, those numbers clearly show that there's further reforms and work needs to be done in the system, and to face the reality of so many children out of home care and what can be done. To that end, in August, on the 25th of August 2017, Commonwealth, State and Territory Community Services Ministers agreed priorities for a national approach for achieving permanency, including systems to measure whether children are achieving permanency and a sense of stability more quickly, rather than that 2 years, 3 years, 4 years. Timeframes for decision making regarding attainment permanency. And that might seem a bit process oriented, but it was really about focusing. All the effort should be how quickly can you make a decision whether a child is going to return back to the family. And then if the decision is made that the child's not safe for the child to return back to that family, then parallel exploring what the options are for permanency, guardianship and adoption, not dragging a process out that can be years and sometimes multiple foster homes. And other key components ensuring that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children placement principles are upheld, which we can discuss with you, support Aboriginal community-controlled organisations to have a role and responsibility for Indigenous children out of home care, explore consistent processes for family reunification as part of the permanency planning, and for the states collectively to look at what are the greater investments that they can do in recruiting, training and supporting permanent carers. That is an area where there's an ageing population of carers. There's also less being prepared, though some of the practices in New South Wales have found that when there was the prospect of permanency or adoption, the number of people being prepared to be carers increased, knowing that that they could have a child reside with them on a permanent basis. The National Permanency Work Plan is expected to be considered by Community Services Ministers on the 1st of June, at the end of next week, when we're having our next Community Services Ministers meeting.
So just to explain to the committee, to anyone who's not familiar with the Institute and where we fit in relation to the Commonwealth and the states and territories, we were established in 1987 by the Australian Government as an independent Commonwealth entity within the health portfolio. A key function of the Institute is to work with state, territory and Australian governments to collect, analyse and publicly report data about the health and welfare of Australians, including working with others to fill data gaps wherever they exist and push for comparability of data across what are often quite disparate service systems. So we're not a policy department, but rather an independent information management agency that attempts to enable other organisations to improve their policies and services and achieve their goals by working with them to create evidence and data collections to inform their decisions. We do our work through a combination of appropriation funding and either project or program specific funding, which generally comes from states, territories or Commonwealth departments. And obviously of relevance to this committee, since the early 1990s, we've been funded by states and territories and worked very closely with them to collate and publish national statistics on the adoption and child protection services they deliver. So I have two members of the team here who are very familiar with some of those detailed statistics, and Barbara's outlined some of the key ones in terms of adoptions of Australian children. The only other things I could add is that the adoptions have been declining in this country for 25 years. And so the recent increase in the last financial year, 2016-17, was the first time adoptions had increased for a long time, and that was primarily because of the increase in the known carer adoptions in New South Wales. So that at 143 of those adoptions, that was the highest number on record. And on the other side of the spectrum, the children in out-of-home care has been increasing over time, including those who have been in long-term out-of-home care, which we define as 2 years or more. And so we work closely in a data advisory capacity with a lot of the working groups that the Commonwealth sits on and the states and territories, trying to provide advice about how to improve data nationally and indicators and measures in response to what the policy drivers are.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Ms Bennett, Ms York. I'll just start with a few questions and then hand to our Deputy Chair. So, Ms Bennett, you mentioned timeliness in the context of all the plans and procedures and indeed studies that are being done, that's one of the key factors. This inquiry has an umbrella focus in terms of what is in the best interests of the child. Given the amount of work and how close you are in relation to the states, the work that you've done with the various different state departments as well as the federal departments in this matter, what do you consider is one of the key factors that's holding back, that's in creating this timeliness issue in relation to time going on and children bouncing around in the system?
I certainly think that the reference that you made to past practices of forced adoption, and I'm not going to go particularly into Indigenous issues, but I think there's been hesitancy, a fear of repeating those same practices. And I think that There's also, in the discussions that I've had, there is certainly social worker training has very much been about family reunification. And I think across all the conversations I've been involved in, that's certainly what the ideal is. If there is something that's happening in a family that has resulted in a child being taken out of it, the efforts by the jurisdictions and the actual practitioners on the ground is to try and intervene, help and support and unite that child back into their biological family. And I think what, as a consequence of that, is that the recognition and the work by New South Wales has shown is that there are too many, and of that 48,000, not all of them will be in that circumstance, but there are too many that are never reunited in their family. Or they're reunited for a short term and then they go back into foster care. I don't know if the Institute has figures, but I've seen somewhere, it could be 2 or 3 placements over a number of years, and that's terrible. The impact on the child is quite terrible. So I think, and also I think there was some structures about legislation, responding to past practices that become difficult to change because there are very mixed views. People have, there is not a universal agreement. I think there's agreement of doing what's best for the child, but how much effort is the right effort versus a quicker solution. And now maybe Miss Mandler will be able to help me, but I think New South Wales also in its practice recognise that at different age groups you need a longer period. And that's about the early bonding of a child and that stability, so that if it's, let's say, a newborn or an under 2-year-old, I can't remember, a quicker decision is really important. Where if you could be 10 or 12, it might be better to be more cautious to see if that needs to be a bit longer on the reunification. So I think that's the context why there's been hesitation.
Yeah.
I also think that it's not something that you can immediately say everybody should be within 6 months or 12 months. What New South Wales, its practice, and I don't know if they've made a submission to you, but I think what they've done is they've carried 2 scenarios at the same time.
Right.
So they've worked on, right, this is our reunification, when do we make an assessment, what interventions we can to reunite, but at the same time, let's look at what our options are. If that doesn't happen, we're fast then in responding to permanency, rather than doing a linear approach.
Yeah. So in relation to New South Wales, and you both mentioned New South Wales, and indeed, Ms York, you mentioned that adoption has been declining steadily in this country for over 25 years. What do you think is one of the key changes to the New South Wales laws that have affected the rates? Because it's quite obvious, isn't it, when you look at the changes in New South Wales adoption rates? I'm
not really across, I'll talk, Kath will answer in a moment, across what legislative changes they made, but I think fundamentally they changed the practice.
Right.
How it was being assessed and delivered on the ground.
And
was the increase?
Pardon?
How significant was the increase as a result?
What was the previous year?
David, it was...
So in terms of the year-on-year increase, we're looking at a doubling from the previous year.
In 1 year.
To 131 in 20.
And all of that doubling came out of New South Wales.
So that's a doubling within the New South Wales figures.
Thank
so
you.
the New South Wales...
Oh, doubling of the New South Wales figures.
Yeah. But that doubled the national figures.
Yes, okay.
Yeah, New South Wales are 131 out of 143.
Yep, gotcha. Thank you.
And so, Ms Bennett, would you agree that one can surmise from the New South Wales change, that one of the areas of change was about that timeliness in terms of, how long should it be that a child is away?
And I think having the 2 systems running in parallel, so that you very early on, while you're still maybe working on reunification, that you've actually, what is the scenario if reunification doesn't happen?
Yeah.
Kath's she can talk to you a bit about where the differences are, and
between the different states. Yeah.
And I think also in New South Wales, in their Child Protection Act, they've got permanent placement principles that set out a bit of a hierarchy where you try to focus on family reunification, then guardianship with a relative or a kin or other suitable person, and then at number 3, they've actually put adoption, so they've put it above some of the other types of orders, except for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children. And then they go down to ministers' guardianship, such as long-term out-of-home care. And then for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children whose best interests are not met by family reunification, kinship care, or minister's guardianship, adoption is the last preference. Right. But as Barbara said...
Can I just add one other bit? Sorry. There's another change, is that in New South Wales, parental consent is generally... They've loosened up, where every other jurisdiction requires parental consent to proceed to the adoption stage.
Okay.
So they have actually made...
point of difference between New South Wales and the other states.
It is looser, and that... and then the hierarchy of defining it, so they've changed their legislation, which has given them more capacity for that.
Okay. Do you think from a national framework perspective, I asked the panel, from a national framework perspective, there are learnings from the New South Wales reforms that we could apply nationally at a national level?
Absolutely. They certainly would be really worthwhile talking to if you have a chance, because also they can talk about how they made it in practice, made it different. Okay. And also, but those numbers are not enormous. But from what I can gather, that trajectory they're on. It is increasing, but also they still haven't lost that aim is to return, if you can, if it's right, if it's best that you work in returning the child, but they're just more conscious and deliberately making those decisions. And and I know that it's... I mentioned that Victoria is having a look at leading some work, because what happens at what's called the Secretary's meeting that supports the ministerial meeting, often pieces of work in certain areas, one state will lead, but others will make a contribution to it. And we know that Victoria is looking very closely, because we're contributing to this. They're looking closely at what were the things that New South Wales did to make that difference.
Yeah. Okay, Ms. Clayton.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks everyone for the evidence there. I was just quickly scanning some of those New South Wales. We just had a submission from the New South Wales government. So
it must have come in quite late, has it? Because I didn't see it.
We just authorised it today.
Right. So I'm sorry, I don't have that information.
No, that's okay. I believe we will have an opportunity to talk with the New South Wales government. So that'll be we'll be able to cover off on some of those. So I'll leave some of those questions there. But I'm interested, because you're up to the really the final years of the national framework for protecting Australia's children now. I'm just interested in some of the kind of lessons learned, and where you think, whilst I acknowledge you've got some draft plans yet to be considered in June, I think, so next month, but...
End of next week.
End of next week?
Yep.
There you are. What do you anticipate to be the kind of future directions for that fourth plan?
And Kath can talk a little bit about the fourth plan. I think the real challenge that we're now, in addition to the fourth plan, which we hope to have endorsed, and there's been some work done on the 1st of June, there's a lot of thinking going on about 2020 beyond. Yep. And how we engage not only with the jurisdictions, because of course being a national plan we need to make sure that we've got the states and territories with us, but also some of the changing best practices, thinking, issues that emerge from the Royal Commission into institutional sexual abuse, what emerged from the Northern Territory. So there's been, since the national framework was established, there has been thinking about how we refresh that. And it may not necessarily be a framework, it could be a national plan in a more concrete way. I think my observation about the learnings is that in 2009, it was a big agenda. And as the years have gone, it's become tighter and sharper, so that it's become more focused action to deliver key things, rather than, I think in the beginning there was a lot put into the basket, and some of them delivered change, and some of them were perhaps became secondary, or once a bigger change they became less of it. Does that make sense? So each of the plans has become more and more focused from the initial 2009.
That's encouraging, although I immediately think of the data that you just presented, which shows we have actually more kids in out-of-home care now than ever before in our history. So something doesn't feel right to me, but
the national
have
plan
that explained.
Wasn't just about out-of-home care. It's also about safe organisations, about development of children. It was a broader
You're
thing.
Absolutely right.
And so the out-of-home care is really I think jurisdictions thought, and I think we probably thought too, is that more money was put on intervention, more about supporting families, that the numbers would come down, and you needed time to see that actually wasn't happening for a whole lot of reasons. Those numbers weren't coming down, and as we started to see just that gradual increase about 2 or 3 years ago, it really started to focus, and it focused at first itself on even trying to tighten using more best practice for interventions, early systems to alert, so that before you actually came in the system was there flags put up that their family was at risk that could occur through access to the health system, could occur at the school. The shift over the last 2 years to try and focus on permanency has been in response to a recognition that there's a proportion that will never return into that family, and that proportion was growing. But Kath, can you talk a little bit about some of the themes for the fourth? And it's a bit odd because they've all been 3 years, and then there's only 2 years left in the formula.
That's right. So with the fourth action plan, as Barbara mentioned, we're trying to focus on those enduring issues. So as part of the lessons learned for us, there is agreement across the broader national forum that supports the framework for protecting Australia's children, states and territories and ourselves, that we really need to keep that focus on prevention and early intervention, and getting in and using data to get in early at those critical intervention points, because there's a lot of research that shows that, at point of first notification, there's a high likelihood that those people, if they don't make it into a substantiated child, abuse, will eventually come into the system at a later point in time. So that will continue under the fourth action plan. Given the significant increase in Indigenous children coming into the child protection system at 10 times the rate of non-Indigenous children, and I think it's about a third of them in out-of-home care. I'm looking at Louise. That significant increase, there is unanimous agreement across states and territories and ourselves that more needs to be done to improve outcomes for Indigenous children coming in contact with, or at risk of coming in contact with, the child protection system. And further, there is agreement we need to do more on, as Barbara mentioned, on permanency, and permanency in all of its forms, be it safe and enduring reunification, be it in having a stable, caring, loving family under an order where people feel like they're connected to that family, connected to kin, connected to culture, connected to country, and their broader support networks. And then finally, as Barbara mentioned, the other enduring theme that we feel we have to do more, which was really highlighted in the Royal Commission into institutional responses to child sexual abuse, is that we need to do more to make organisations more child safe. So all organisations coming in contact with children to ensure that children's rights are protected and promoted.
Thanks. I have another question that's really... given the really minuscule numbers of adoptions that take place when we look at, the number of kids in our home care, it's probably 0.6%, I kind of roughly estimated.
I was just asking a question because there's also been a shift on permanency placement, and I don't think we collect that from the jurisdictions, and that would add a question. So we're talking about adoption, but if you can give permanent guardianship to someone...
we do have third-party parental care orders. We have quite a bit of information on orders.
So I think that's another part of the story. When you've got 48,000 in out-of-home care and such a low number of adoption, which is terrific, how many are actually being given, they could be to a foster parent, so that they're not being returned, I think.
So do you have that data? Because that would be an important part of the conversation.
Yes, we have. So we do know that a quarter of the children that were in long-term out-of-home care for 2 years or more were on a third-party parental care order, which generally goes until they're 18. So they have a...
But that can be stopped at any time? Changed or altered at any time?
It depends if it's been court determined, and that depends on the jurisdiction.
Yeah.
And if it's a court-based, from my understanding, the biological parents could seek to have that court order reversed. But I don't know. I saw something, I can't remember, it was from you, but a lot do go, a lot never do. They stay with those parents that have received the permanent guardianship. But I don't know if we've got those long-term tracking. Do we?
I think I want to come back to my original question that I was trying to ask before we kind of got off onto some other data issues. I'm happy for that conversation to continue, but I'd like to just, my original point was it is a very, very small amount of people that are children that move from an out-of-home care environment into a local adoption. And I'm wondering if you think that is going to shift. Like, do you see in following fourth action plans or New South Wales laws that they're going to see a continuing increase there? If so, what you think that trajectory might look like? I know that's a bit of a crystal ball question, but I'm trying to sense whether we would expect very large increases with reforms to laws or not, and because there's clearly that is a pathway for a very, very, very small amount of the children that we are talking about here. So
I don't think we can forecast that. I think there's two answers to that. It'd be better to see what happens to New South Wales over the next 2 or 3 years to see how their practice creates change. We believe there's an increase for this year. And secondly, the piece of work that we talked about with Victoria that's being conducted between all the jurisdiction, that isn't completed, and where that lands will determine whether other states start doing a bit more of what New South Wales has been doing. So for all that crystal ball, I don't think we can give an answer to that question.
Are there sort of more common arrangements of permanency for children that is not the local adoption? You were referring to that in your earlier discussions with Ms York around the data collection, I think, and that is some other pathways to permanency that are not about local adoption.
And of course kinship, grandparents, and in Indigenous kinship care too. I don't know if we...
How do you count that?
Well, partly we collect it in our department because it can be the transfer of family tax benefit payments under kinship arrangements, or it can be because the state provides fostering assistance. So it's not collected in you register and you're a kinship carer.
We do have some information on that from the state governments as well. So we have information on the orders that the children are under. So we know about the numbers of children under long-term guardianship or custody orders, and of those we know which children are with relatives or kin.
So can I just build on that point? So of the 48,000 children in out-of-home care, how many are in kinship?
I can answer that. So we've got 47%. So 93% of children out of home care as of the 30th of June 2017 were in home-based care, and of that 93%, 47% were in relative or kinship care, 38% were in foster care, 7% were in third-party parental care, and 1% were in other home-based care. And just going to your earlier question around, other arrangements other than adoption, each jurisdiction has its own form of longer-term permanency order. They've all got different names. So in New South Wales, they have an order allocating parental responsibility. So I think in the hierarchy of permanency, it sort of sits just below adoption. Victoria has a permanent care order, and all of these orders confer parental responsibility for the child until they're 18. And Queensland's got long-term guardianship. I understand it's looking at that and potentially another arrangement later this year. Western Australia has a protection order for special guardianship. South Australia has long-term guardianship. Tasmania transfers guardianship. Northern Territory has a permanent care order, but they're all sort of variations on a theme, and they all have that common characteristic of trying to create a more permanent, parental type order, while still maintaining the supports and the monitoring of the department.
And if we go back to the conversation about the work that we're trying to do and some of the things that were agreed by ministers, part of that was actually about having common definitions, collecting data, so that it can be apples and apples, and not just a limited amount where there is, a court order or. So that has actually been, and I know sometimes it's hard for people to think that getting good data is actually an achievement, but it really is in something like that because it allows you to break it down and really understand what's happening.
My final question, and then I'll hand over to others. I mean, do we have any sense of how many people are seeking to adopt, but the obstacles are just too great, or for whatever reason, they don't actually get to finalise the process and end up with
We don't collect information on people who have registered for adoption. Anecdotally, we have a snapshot into inter-country adoption because we provide some coordination. And we know that it's a reasonable number of people that would like to do an international adoption. And I would just have to conclude that they will have tried domestic and before that could have been one step, but the states might be able to tell you. But I think there is a reasonable number of people, a few hundred, few thousand, that would like to adopt a child, and those processes are also very different in every state. And this was the point earlier when New South Wales said that they also believe that it will change the profile of people wanting to foster if there is a prospect of permanency, if that becomes better known and it eventuates, because we also, you would have seen and heard too that it's very disheartening sometimes that you might have a child for 2 or 3 years and then they return to their, and often return to their biological parents, and that often they don't take a second foster. But there are some people that are just amazing and constantly take lots of children, short-term, long-term, as almost professional foster carers. But the demographics on that, and it's been a worry and it's been raised, and it was one of the references about the training and skilling, is that they're ageing. They're an ageing group. And it's then hard for the states when they take a child out to actually find available foster parents that will take that. And that's also another issue that's really pushing some of those reforms, because putting children into institutional residential arrangements, young children, is not really a satisfactory outcome.
Thank you.
Slightly terrifying outcome.
Thanks, Ms. Clayton. I'll ask Mr. Enquiry.
I'm just interesting. I mean, there are a lot of inconsistencies across all the different jurisdictions. It would seem to me, with such a high level of kids that are in the situation, that maybe what we need to look at is some sort of an umbrella and from a national perspective, so that because it would be confusing for families as well to try and understand what needs to be done to be able to have an opportunity to get a child, to have a child in their home. And so I'm just wondering whether or not that's something that has been considered, where we have a national approach to this, so that all jurisdictions are basically the same in relation to the fundamentals of.
I would have to say that that's certainly what was agreed last year by ministers. There was a lot of push by us and probably New South Wales to try and at least get some shared goals, and I'm hoping that this work being done with Victoria can be considered. I think you're right, but it's just. But I would like to say that I think some of the Indigenous issues, we need to be very careful about handling them in the right way and recognising the placement principles that have taken a long time to develop. So
they can still form part of
yes, they can be
the
accepted
overall or policy. I mean, how far you said last year there was an opportunity to, or you were moving in that direction. Yes. How much further has it progressed, or is it just basically ended up as an idea?
So there's been quite a bit of work since last year. So just to clarify, last year Community Services Ministers agreed to a shared outcome statement for achieving permanency, and they agreed to guiding principles for permanency, which, as you mentioned, also take into account the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander child placement principle. So that's embedded as a form of permanency in that work. They are looking to agree timeframes which promote timely decision making and committing to a hierarchy of permanency options being reflected in their legislation and or policy and practice. And they've also committed to national reporting on permanency timeframes that are achieved, and
public
reporting.
And just if I can emphasise that, because I think that given the mixed views, it'll stand out if one state is making decisions within 6, 12, 18, 2 years, and another jurisdiction is not making a decision for 5, 6, 7 years. And that will actually, I think, those public reporting start to really focus policymaker and departments' lens on other jurisdictions doing best practice. And to also be, there's no suggestion that the Commonwealth would take over national child protection. I mean, it just would not be feasible. It just would not be feasible. You need that network, you need that workforce, you need that skill, that connection into the community. So we also have to be very cognisant of our role is to sort of help work and broker those deals. And look at things like our capacity for national reporting, which becomes the evidence base, work on practice and look at the issues about, carer workforces. They're the things that we can contribute to, not actually be in there having a national child protection system. It's just...
Can I? Well, and I mean, I'm not suggesting that we do that. However, I've been in this job for a long time, 21 years, and over that years, the concerns that have been raised by me by families or couples that are desperately are childless and desperately want a child, or they have a child and desperately want another one, is that they either are frustrated by the delays in trying to go, and they desperately would like to adopt a child, a local child. They either are frustrated by the extensive delays in trying to access a child and give up and hope for something from a child from overseas, or alternatively they've run out of time and the age beats them. Because the delays are so profound that eventually, and are bitterly disappointed and they would make fabulous parents, and yet they run out of time because of age limits and things like this.
Well, I think that goes to the answer that I gave to the Deputy Chair, is that while we don't We don't know. I mean, certainly, if you wanted to, we could write to the jurisdiction and ask them how many, to see if they're prepared to tell us how many people they actually have on their list, of people wanting to be to adopt or permanency. We could ask that. And you could ask also when you've got it, but in answering the Deputy Chair, we actually do believe that it is a reasonable number. And I think the point that you've made about the age is really important, because people might often try for some time and then not, they might be in their late 30s or something when they realise that they're not going to have their own child. And therefore that time, and I don't know if Kath has it, but I think for most jurisdictions it's somewhere between 40 and 45 where that is then considered too old for adoption. And then that applies for international adoption too. Countries have different rules about what the age is as well. So, I think it is a valid point, and I think it is very disheartening. But as I said, it's too early. We don't collect the data on who wants to be, who's got their name on a list to be adopted, and it's too early to say if these changes for those factors I raised are actually going to make a difference for increasing the number of children that are available for adoption or permanency.
Okay. Ms. Hazel? Hi, I have a number of questions. We've talked a lot about the data and all the rest of it. What we haven't talked about is what are the effects? What all this legislative, work, the collection data, the lack thereof, families ageing out of the process. What's the effect of the child when we don't give them the opportunity to be placed in a permanent home and we've got them on care orders that can be revoked by any district court or local court? What's the effect of the children?
And we can go into that in a bit more detail, but it isn't good. It's recognised. There's a whole lot of body of research about first 2 years of bonding, the first 1,000 days, how important that is in the child development. But I'd also like to premise before Ms. Mandler goes into it is that sometimes that is, given the numbers that are in kinship, you can't necessarily, or with grandparents, necessarily see a disruptor for every one of those 48,000, right? That they may have moved into stable arrangements, but we do know that it is not a good outcome for a child. And
how long have we known that it's not a good outcome for the children?
Decades.
Probably decades, but also there's been, in my observation, is that probably in the last, certainly in this decade, there's been much more research on the first 1,000 days, which you will hear much more about that you wouldn't have heard about 5 or 6 years ago. And that's from actually conception, about healthy maternal health, not drinking, not smoking, and then that first 2 years. And it's not just for the child, it's the way in which the mother bonds with the child. And that's where
I've known about that for a long time. I'm a mother to a 16-year-old, so that was around when I was, her mum when she was a baby. So
yeah. I've got older kids too, though, mind you, the bonding in the first 2 years was often a challenge sometimes. But more science and data has gone behind it about the child's response. And also, of course, in developing some of the interventions to play on the mother's maximum maternal time. How interventions that the states and some of the stuff that we're doing about absolutely improving basic parenting skills in that 2 years is also a really important thing. And it does diminish the reality of, even in the best families, the maternal, it diminishes and changes, it nurtures in a different way. But Kath, can you talk about some of the impacts?
Yeah. So we know, and the research is pretty consistent on this, that children who have extended periods in out-of-home care, who drift in care, it's been linked with negative outcomes for mental health and well-being, educational attainment. They often have trouble finding suitable accommodation, poor employment outcomes, and poor life satisfaction and relational stability. And some of the more severe impacts, we know there's a link with drifting in care and homelessness. disproportionately high rates of substance abuse and vulnerability to further abuse and violence. And then you've also got the intergenerational child abuse coming into...
So, and can I just add one bit, is also it's even worse. That's pretty bad, that list, but it's worse when they've gone to 2 foster placements, 3 foster placements, and by the time they've reached further, it's terrible. It's a lifetime of harm.
I find it completely abhorrent that the best that we can come up with, is to lay the responsibility. And no single jurisdiction in this country has ever done child protection well at all. That we can come up with these lists and try and do better, but with nothing nationally consistent. Even the register for prospective adopting parents. There might be a kid sitting in WA that's suited to a family in Sydney that's small enough to pick them up and move them across. That to me is quite frankly disgraceful. I noticed there's some quite big gaps in the collection of evidence. But the other thing that I wanted to really ask about, and I do have a couple of pages of questions, but I know that the paediatrician at the end of the table probably wants to...
Can I just say on that point there about moving interstate? I mean, kids are quite regularly moved from the other side of the world into loving, caring homes here in Australia and develop into highly functional, wonderful adults. And it's just interesting that, that moving them just between states and territories, the complexities associated with that.
I might make 2 observations. Firstly, I think you should certainly ask the states when you talk to them about those issues. But the other issue, I think, is because there hasn't been many, that they've probably had enough people in their state when those numbers that we're talking about, such a large number in out-of-home care, and those New South Wales numbers have been to New South Wales because there's enough people in the New South Wales queue to take them on. But certainly this is not something that we have line of sight on those numbers. And who's in the...
To that point, sorry to interrupt, Ms. Mann, but to that point, there is a national queue, isn't there? We've got to assume that there is a national queue of loving family homes, loving Australians,
And it could be something. It could be something that you might consider in that we shine a light and you guys collect it of how many people at what point and how long they stay in it. Because I do think it's the other side of it is not only just the children, but how many parents have you, prospective parents do you have in it? But it's
that comes to the core of this inquiry in terms of streamlining it from a national framework point of view, and to
seeing the other side of the story as well.
Flush out these issues of why can't there be that mobility within our own backyard when there is from overseas countries and quite successfully. Sorry,
I've got two final things. The family reunification process. There doesn't seem to be anything around best practice about what that is and what that looks like. And to me, anecdotally, what it looks like is parents are given chance and time again to get their act together, for want of a better word. Obviously, each case is different, but is there anything that is actually nationally consistent? I mean, and I don't mean to say that we've got a timeline and you've got 6 months, but there has to be a point in any of these cases where we pull up stops and say enough's enough. There is the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, and the children have a right to stability. So why this seems to rest on the side of the parents having more control and power in this situation than a completely vulnerable child?
I think the New South Wales work is actually turning some of that over by making much quicker decisions about reunification, putting the child in the centre for those reasons, and making a much quicker decision about reunification, and then having this second option available so that they can move. Sort of happens a bit concurrently, so that you can move quickly on it.
But there's no national framework that says these are our gold standards, this is where we want you to meet, this is what we'll accept, and then...
I don't think there is there, Kath, national best practice?
Not quite to that extent, but we are looking as part of the permanency reform work that we're progressing with states and territories, looking at a more nationally consistent approach to reunification and how states and territories actually go about doing the reunification process. So that has been highlighted as an activity area that we need to look more closely at as part of the permanency reform work.
And before we get to all of this, we've got the situation of a lot of the states are doing individual work at the moment on increasing the foster care age from 18 to 21, and there's a lot of focus and attention on that, and I do believe that's also an issue.
Yes.
But why are we trying to strengthen temporary care when we should actually be looking to strengthening permanent care?
I think the shift for foster care is...
Because, of course, I don't mean to cut you off, but, of course, if they were adopted at 16 or 10 or 12 or 8 or 4 or 2, this wouldn't be an issue when they get to 18 and they need to be booted out into adult life. And, of course, most 18-year-olds these days are not quite adult ready to life. So we look to be strengthening the wrong end of what's happening.
I don't think it is intended to strengthen the wrong end. I think it is actually a reflection that it's a reflection of the benefit arrangements paid to foster care. These are likely to have been in some long-term care, and what the state governments are looking at is extending the not huge, but the monetary payment to help support so that it continues for a longer period. I don't think it's... I see the point that you've drawn from it, but I don't actually think it's a related point. It's about providing
financial support
for those. And I said to you that some foster parents do a number of children. So if they're keeping someone beyond the 18, they've probably had them for a number of years as a foster, and it's providing some financial assistance. I mean, I don't have the details, but most of the conversations that I've had is that if someone's been fostering someone for a long time, they don't throw them out at 18. But it's reflecting...
That's in those long-term ones, but we've got a lot of kids that have bounced between a number or back to
I think
family,
that there's...
and then back in the system.
I don't know, but I've seen that often when they've been... By the time they're in late adolescence and they've bounced in and out, they're probably in residential care rather than going back into families. There'll be that other portion.
Thank you, Ms Hassan. Dr Freelander,
I'll be
just
very
conscious
quick.
of time because we've got a 6 o'clock clean break. Yes.
I'm sorry I arrived late too. Just a couple of very quick questions, and thank you very much for mentioning the first 1,000 days. I think that first 1,000 days should be a health policy that we adopt when we're in government, definitely. A couple of questions. Of the 315 adoptions that were finalised in 2016 to 2017, how many were kids with disabilities? Okay.
No way of getting that data?
That's possible.
In that case, that's something we'd like to put on notice. I think it'd be useful to know that.
Yep.
If we don't have it, we could write to the jurisdictions and do that. We'll have...
Okay.
Yeah. And it just may take a little... We'll try and get it.
Sure. So
you guys will try and get it, but you might have to write to them if we don't have it.
We're going on for a couple of months. So.
So if you take that question on notice, and
Yeah, because my experience is that for children with disabilities, it's a disincentive for adoption because government assistance stops often. NDIS may make a difference to that. Second question I've got is, it seems, and just as a quick statement, it seems to me that the biggest problem we have in the whole area, out-of-home care adoption, is lack of appropriate data. We really don't know what we're talking about till we get appropriate data. Do you need more resources to collect that data?
I can respond. In part, a lot of the issues with the data are about the lack of comparability of the legislation, policies and processes in the state, and us trying to make sense of that in the data. And it's at the jurisdictional level, the investment in more data is probably where it's required.
Yeah. And last question. There has been a trend of recent years, particularly in New South Wales, to outsource out-of-home care to non-government organisations. Do you think that's a good thing or a bad thing?
I don't have a view on that. Have you?
I haven't seen any evaluation from those jurisdictions.
Neither have I.
Yeah. So you might want to ask them that question when they come. We haven't seen anything on that.
Can I just ask one here? It was actually... this was very useful. It was raised earlier. Oh, sorry, through the chair. I do apologise. The issue of the cut-off at 18. Most kids, if they're, to complete their education, That's just the start of the tertiary. And, you know, those kids, those larger number of kids, I suspect, that haven't been in long-term care that continue that support, they end up end up either, you know, basically on their own or wherever. Wouldn't it be worth considering extending the time frame, at least to allow the kids to finish a university? You know, I mean, we say kids independent now if they're staying with their family till they're 23 or 24 or something like that. Wouldn't that be something that would be worth considering to allow support for those kids in a family environment as they do either their training or their university degree, whatever they're going to do, to give them more opportunities in their adult life?
I think that the state consideration of the moving to 21 is part of that, whether that's right or wrong. There are benefits that are just universally provided by our department, such as study allowance and things like that, which are also available to the universal. So I think the who's being paid what for how long, we feel that it is a good move for at least the shift for the 21. I don't get a sense that we've had any discussion with the jurisdictions about them considering 23, but you might want to raise that with some more.
And in varying degrees, they're all starting to look at this, and you know, they've got varying degrees of supports that they provide post 18. So, as Barbara said, if you take that up with each individual jurisdiction,
The family unit, I think that's critical.
Yeah. Ms. Hassar,
last one, and probably you might have to take notice, or it might just be a comment. But in response to the Royal Commission into responses to child sex abuse, A, do you think that there's enough being done to prevent it going forward in the future? And B, are you responsible, or have you got a view on how we know what happened, we know where it went wrong? What are we doing to prevent it moving forward?
I think the work that we're doing with the state jurisdictions to develop child-safe organisations, and it's actually, this is going to be something brought forward to COAG in the later part of this year, but the state's signing off, and that, just really quickly in your time, that child-safe organisation...
I think in the interest of time, because that's
we'll put it on
big
writing.
question.
It's a big
so
question.
We'll put that on
but the answer is
and if you
all the state jurisdictions are going to sign on to something which is going to change reporting, the child's voice, independent, national statements, and they're going to regulate it through childcare, scout groups, everyone, and they'll be responsive. And you can never guarantee to prevent it, but it will be a marked improvement to where we've been.
Yeah. Thank you. So I think thank you, Ms.
We'll
Lynch.
take that on more detail to tell you where.
If you could take that and Dr. Freelander's question to yourselves as well. Look, thank you for your attendance here today and for all the work that you've done. If you have been asked to provide any additional information, would you please forward it to the Secretariat by Friday, June the 1st, 2018?
That might be a bit longer for this stuff. We might have to extend that one.
For that one, how much time do you think it would? Just a summary analysis.
Can they just? We can do a summary analysis on what the Royal Commission said and the work that we've been doing on out-of-home care. These guys probably have
Ours
to talk
will be an urgent request to the states to see if they capture that information and to ask them to supply it as quickly as possible. But we have
It's
it
outside
supplied.
your,
It's
outside
our control. Unfortunately, we'll put a quick response to it.
And work with the Secretariat.
If you work with the Secretariat in terms of, it's not a dead timeline. You'll be certainly be sent a copy of the transcript of your evidence, and we'll have an opportunity to request corrections to transcription errors. And again, thank you for your attendance here today, and I thank the committee for their questions. Thank you.
Thank you.